Welcome to part 2 of our lecture on Aboriginal American culture.
When the first Europeans and Africans arrived in North America, they discovered a continent populated by more than 350 distinctive societies with almost as many languages. This map shows the geographic regions where various groups shared certain lifestyle practices due to their common environments. For this lesson, we will take a look at how indigenous communities in 4 of these geographic regions adapted their environments to meet their needs. The Southwest comprises an area made up of the modern states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and Southern California. Because of the unique geographic features of the American Southwest, native farmers learned to harness the power of the region's precious rivers using methods perfected over the course of 3,000 years. Native dwellers of the region had adopted living practices as varied as the tightly constructed and space-minimizing style of the Pueblo Indians, so named by early Spanish explorers after their distinctive design, to the generally dispersive settlement patterns of the Pimas, whose dwellings were often separated by as much of a mile's length of territory. The Pimas' choice of architecture was justified by their belief that such arrangements minimized neighborly disputes. On the other hand, the Pueblos appreciated the closely knit structure of their dwellings, insisting that it inspired a more deeply felt sense of community. Besides agriculture, native groups in this region, like the Haida and the Inuit, took advantage of their environment's natural endowments to provide food, shelter, and cultural artifacts. The Haida is most famous for their tribal totem poles, while the Inuit have been romanticized in lore by their more common designation, the Eskimo. It should be noted that the Inuit do not refer to themselves as Eskimos. In Spanish, the word Eskimo means eaters of raw meat. The word Inuit in their native language simply means the folk or the people, so this is what we will call them. Groups in the American Southeast probably had the easiest climes to contend with for farming. This area is loosely defined as the region housing tribes as geographically diverse as the lower Midwest to the subtropics of the Gulf Plains to the Appalachian Highlands. As geography dictated the types of economic activities natives in that region conducted, so too did cultural mores govern societal behaviors. For example, Natchez native societies were class-based. Some subsets of Creeks, especially those who lived in northern Florida, had societies that were more egalitarian. As with most of the other areas we have examined, cultivation appeared to be the primary economic activity. Historical evidence suggests that native populations in these areas lived under intricately designed systems of government that could easily shatter previously held and popularly held stereotypes regarding native savagery and barbarism. Iroquois tribe employed an almost legislative/judicial style of governance to regulate the flow of conflicts it had between them and their neighbors. Evidence suggests that the Iroquois and some of their Great Lakes neighbors functioned in a fairly democratic society where women were vital members of the decision-making process. Of course, this wasn't true for all tribes in the region. The Algonquin, for instance, operated in a patriarchal society, and unlike the Iroquois, preferred to operate their communities autonomously. Another key dimension of native societies was how they're organized along gender lines. Several groups in this region were considered patriarchal, which is the opposite of what was seen in many southeastern tribes, which were matriarchal in nature. Patriarchal describes a society that is male-led and male-dominated, while matriarchal describes a society that is female-led and dominated. Both words are derived from the Latin. Patriarchal comes from the Latin word pater, which means father, while matriarchal is derived from mater, which means mother. In the case of the Iroquois, we see a society that is neither patriarchal or matriarchal. We see instead an egalitarian society, or a society where power is shared equally along gender lines. As important as it is for us to remember that Native Americans did not comprise a monolithic group, it is also interesting to note that there were some commonalities that marked them apart from the Europeans they would later encounter. It is also important to note that the common cultural practices of the native cultures were the same practices that would prove to be major sources of conflict between the two societies. One such shared cultural trait was religion. Unlike the Europeans, whose beliefs sprang from the authority of written scriptures as well as a large body of supplemental religious literature and a highly organized clergy, native societies almost universally relied on oral transmission, dreams, and artificially altered states of consciousness induced by ingesting or smoking herbs or mushrooms. Instead of a belief in a single sovereign god who ruled over all, many Indian groups were polytheistic. To followers of these religious belief systems, everything in the natural world possessed spirits and, as such, was worthy of worship or acknowledgement. The first Americans viewed nature in a different light than Europeans. To them, God commanded men to subdue the earth and to have dominion over every living thing. This was a view many Europeans cherished in large part because it formed the basis of their Christian belief system. On the other hand, while indigenous Americans were willing to alter their natural surroundings to increase their food supply and comfort level, they felt that ignoring the residual spirits in nature could endanger the body and soul. Still, other groups thought that the unnecessary slaughter of wild animals could result in their spirits unleashing untold disasters on those responsible for the outrage. To protect themselves from the adverse effects of vengeful animal spirits, hunting was conducted according to strict spiritual rules. For example, the Micmac peoples applied a specially prescribed treatment to hunted moose and beaver, even though the hunting and trapping of these two animals were essential to the group's survival. The importance of the spiritual world extended to sacred places, pilgrimages, and even sports. For instance, before stickball games, Cherokee athletes abstained from sexual intercourse for 1 month and refrained from eating rabbit for fear of becoming weak and timid. The night before the game, they built a big campfire and danced through the night to the rhythms of drums, chants, and rattles. Shamans said prayers, painted the athletes' bodies, and smoked pipes. This was done less to ensure the victory and more to enhance the spiritual dimension of the games. Property ownership would prove to be yet another point of contention between the first Americans and the Europeans in encounter after encounter. Private ownership of land and the transformation of the land's resources into individual wealth were foreign concepts to Native Americans. Rather than setting aside land for private profiting and enjoyment, indigenous societies offered their resources to all their group members. They enjoyed communal control. Some groups took this belief a step farther by being appalled at the very thought that land could be bought and sold. To these native groups, such as the Appalachee and the Miccosukes, the earth was your mother. To these groups, no reasonable person would buy and sell their mother, would they? Because of their communal views of land and resource ownership, indigenous societies, unlike their European counterparts, had no charity houses because there was rarely a class of distinctly poor people. Families seldom hoarded maize or beans when any member of the group faced starvation or famine. Law and order was seen differently in native societies. There was rarely legislation, elaborate judicial systems, or police forces to speak of to maintain societal order. Natives relied on public disapproval, shame, ridicule, shunning, or most drastically expulsion from the community to curb dangerous antisocial behavior. In time, some Europeans would come to see the beauty of the indigenous approach to life. During the colonial wars in which both the French and the English employed indigenous allies, native people sometimes took white people into their families. When the opportunity arose for these white captives to return to their familiar environs, many captives refused to go back to their white families over the protests of their families. Benjamin Franklin, in trying to ascertain why this would happen, remarked, "In a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first opportunity of escaping again to the woods." It can be argued that these so-called white Indians preferred the strong sense of community, integrity, and generosity of Native American ways to the individualistic and competitive yet civilized ways of the European. But this begs the question, who decides what is civilized anyway? To bring closure to this part of our study, first, we need to establish that Christopher Columbus did not discover America. One historian said it best when he noted that Columbus established contact between two worlds, both already old. Far from being the virgin territory that Europeans supposed it to be, North America had vibrant communities, teeming with life and culture, contrary to what Europeans may have thought. The idea of civilization is also something we will explore, especially the notion of who decided or decides what exactly is civilized. What happens when different definitions of civilizations are forced upon a society without community sensitivity? We also need to consider how we have allowed this dynamic to color the world in which we have operated in for centuries. This is the end of lesson number 1.